Imagine for a second that it is decades or maybe centuries in the future. You are lying in a clinic, and a machine is scanning every single microscopic detail of your brain. Then, your biological body shuts down, but a monitor on the wall blinks to life. You look out through a camera lens, and you realize you are now entirely digital. The question is, are you actually experiencing this, or did you just die? And what is left is just a highly advanced piece of software imitating you perfectly. Welcome back to the podcast, everyone. Today we are diving into some incredibly deep waters. We are looking at a brilliant philosophical analysis by David J. Chalmers, featured in the book Intelligence Unbound. The chapter is called Uploading a Philosophical Analysis, and let me tell you, this completely broke my brain in the best way possible.
It is a phenomenal piece of work, really. What Chalmers does so well here is take something that usually belongs strictly to the realm of science fiction, mind uploading, and treats it with extreme philosophical rigor. He forces us to confront what consciousness actually is, and whether we could ever truly transfer it out of our biological bodies. Because if we are ever going to match the sheer speed and capacity of non-biological systems, artificial intelligence, we are probably going to have to leave our biological core behind entirely. But as Chalmers points out, that migration from brain to computer is not just a technological hurdle. It is arguably the ultimate philosophical trapdoor.
Right. Because before we even talk about whether the uploaded mind is conscious, we have to understand how we actually get the mind into the machine in the first place. Chalmers outlines a few different ways this could theoretically happen, and some of them are pretty intense. He talks about destructive, gradual, and non-destructive uploading. Let us break those down, because the method itself kind of sets the stage for the philosophical crisis that follows. Destructive uploading sounds exactly like what it is, right?
Exactly. And surprisingly, it is widely considered to be the first method that might actually become feasible. Chalmers describes a process called serial sectioning. Imagine freezing a brain completely solid. Then, you analyze its structure layer by microscopic layer. In each layer, you are mapping out the exact distribution of every single neuron, every connection, every synapse. You take all that incredibly dense map of information and load it into a computer model designed to perfectly simulate neural dynamics. But the catch is right there in the name. To get the map, you have to destroy the original territory. The original biological brain is sliced away to nothing.
That is terrifying. It is literally a death-to-rebirth scenario, assuming the rebirth actually works. But then, he brings up gradual uploading, which is maybe even wilder, because it happens while you are still alive and functioning. He mentions nanotransfer. How does that one work?
This is where we get into advanced nanotechnology. Picture microscopic devices, essentially tiny robots, being inserted into your living brain. Each nanobot attaches itself to a single neuron. It sits there, observing, learning, and simulating the exact behavior and connectivity of that specific biological neuron. Once the nanobot has perfectly mimicked the neuron's behavior, it seamlessly takes over the neuron's job. It replaces the original biological cell, starts communicating via radio transmitters to a computer, and then the process moves on to the next neuron. It repeats this billions of times until eventually, piece by piece, your entire biological brain has been replaced by synthetic emulations, and all your cognitive processing is running on a computer.
That is the ship of Theseus paradox applied to the human mind. If you replace every plank of wood on a ship over time, is it the same ship? If you replace my brain one cell at a time, at what exact moment do I become a machine? It is a slow, creeping transformation. And then, of course, the third option he mentions is the one I think everyone would actually prefer, which is non-destructive uploading.
Yes, the Holy Grail, as Chalmers calls it. This would require some incredibly advanced, non-invasive brain imaging technology. Think of something like an fMRI scanner today, but with a resolution so unimaginably fine that it can read and record the dynamics of individual neurons and synapses in real time without doing any physical harm to the biological brain at all. You just put on a helmet, get scanned, and a digital copy of you is spun up on a server. Now, he notes that this kind of technology is not even on the horizon yet, though imaging tech is advancing rapidly. But regardless of which of these three methods we use, they all inevitably smash into a massive, unavoidable wall.
The question of survival. If I do this, will I actually survive? And Chalmers splits this into two of the hardest questions in philosophy. First, will the uploaded version of me actually be conscious? And second, will it actually be me? Now, the text we are diving into focuses heavily on that first question, the consciousness problem. Because if the upload is not conscious, the second question does not even matter. If there is no consciousness, there is no you. You are just gone.
That is the absolute crux of the issue. To understand why this is so difficult, we have to look at how humans experience the world right now. You and I, ordinary human beings, are conscious. There is something it is like to be us. We have a subjective character to our experiences. When we look at a sunset, we do not just process optical data. We actually feel something. We experience the redness of the sky. We experience the sound of music, the feeling of cold water. These conscious experiences are the entire foundation of our mental lives. They are what give human life meaning and value.
So, if my only remaining footprint in the universe is a digital upload, and that upload has zero capacity for this kind of subjective conscious experience, I have essentially ceased to exist. I might be a really smart chatbot that talks like me and remembers my childhood, but inside, the lights are off. Chalmers calls this a zombified existence. A life with all the external behavior of a human, but totally stripped of meaning and value because there is no inner world.
Precisely. And this leads us to the fundamental problem. Can an artificial upload actually be conscious? And the brutally honest answer right now is that we have no idea, primarily because our scientific and philosophical understanding of consciousness itself is actually quite poor. We simply do not know why or how squishy biological brain processes somehow magically give rise to the subjective feeling of being alive.
Wait, but what about neuroscience? We are mapping the brain. We know which areas light up when we feel pain or see colors. Doesn't that mean we are getting closer to understanding consciousness?
Neuroscience is definitely making huge strides in finding what we call the neural correlates of consciousness, meaning they can see that when you feel pain, a specific brain region is active, but correlation is not explanation. That research program largely takes the existence of consciousness as a given. It tells us what happens in the brain when we feel something, but it does not tell us why that physical activity creates a feeling in the first place. Chalmers points out that there is absolutely no orthodox scientific theory that explains why consciousness even exists, let alone what kinds of systems, biological or digital, are capable of having it.
This brings up what philosophers call the further fact of consciousness, right? The idea that you could know literally everything about the physical mechanics of a system, but still know absolutely nothing about its subjective experience. The text brings up a really famous thought experiment here. To illustrate this, Frank Jackson's story of Mary, the neuroscientist. Can you walk us through that? I love this example.
It is a classic. Imagine a brilliantly smart neuroscientist named Mary. From the day she was born, she has been locked in a room that is entirely black and white. She has only ever seen black, white, and shades of gray. But inside this room, she studies the science of vision through a black and white monitor. She learns every single physical fact there is to know about color. She knows exactly what wavelengths of light correspond to the color red. She knows exactly how those wavelengths hit the retina, how the optic nerve fires, and how the brain processes that data. Physically, neurologically, she knows everything about the color red.
Okay, so she has total objective knowledge of the mechanics.
Right. But then, one day, the door to the room opens, and Mary walks out. And right in front of her is a brilliant, bright red apple. For the very first time in her life, she actually sees the color red. The philosophical question is this. When she sees that apple, does she learn something new?
Wow. I mean, intuitively, yes, absolutely. She might know the physics of red, but she never knew what it actually felt like to look at it.
Exactly. And if she learns something new, that proves that completely exhaustive physical knowledge of a system leaves something out. It leaves out the conscious experience. The subjective, what it is like. Chalmers extends this further. A complete physical description of a mouse, tracing every neuron and muscle, does not tell us what it is like to be a mouse. It does not even tell us if there is anything it is like to be a mouse. We do not have a consciousness meter that we can just plug into an animal or a computer to see if there is a mind in there.
So if we build an incredibly complex digital brain, a perfect replica of my brain, there is going to be a huge, terrifyingly unobvious question about whether it is actually conscious. And because we have no consciousness meter, we are essentially flying blind. This feels like the ultimate gamble. You step into the uploading machine, hoping you wake up on the other side, but maybe you just die, and a philosophical zombie walks out wearing your digital skin. This debate really splits philosophers into different camps, doesn't it? The text mentions biological theorists versus functionalist theorists. What is the dividing line there?
The dividing line is basically about what consciousness is made of. The biological theorists of consciousness argue that consciousness is deeply and intrinsically tied to biological matter, carbon, water, proteins, the specific messy chemistry of life. In their view, no completely non-biological system could ever be conscious. It is a biological phenomenon, like photosynthesis. You cannot have photosynthesis without chlorophyll, and maybe you cannot have consciousness without biological neurons.
So, if the biological theorists are right, then mind uploading is a complete dead end. We cannot survive in an uploaded digital form because a computer runs on silicon and electricity, not carbon and biology. If they are right, An upload will always be an unconscious zombie.
That is the harsh reality of the biological view. But then you have the functionalist theorists. Functionalism argues that what matters for consciousness is not the specific physical material a brain is made of, but rather its causal structure and its functional role. To use a computer analogy, functionalists believe that consciousness is more like software than hardware. As long as the information processing is organized exactly the same way, the system can be conscious, whether it is running on a biological wetware brain or a silicon hardware computer.
That makes sense. It is like a calculator. It does not matter if the calculator is made of plastic and microchips, or if I build a giant mechanical calculator out of wooden gears. As long as it performs the function of adding 2 plus 2 to get 4, it is calculating. So, the functionalist is saying, as long as the digital brain functions exactly like my biological brain, it will generate consciousness. Which side does Chalmers actually fall on here?
Chalmers strongly leans toward the functionalist view. He admits that, yes, we have absolutely no idea how a non-biological system, like a silicon computer, could be conscious. But he flips the argument on its head with a brilliant counterpoint. He says, we also have absolutely no idea how a biological neural system can be conscious. The mystery, the explanatory gap, is exactly as wide in both cases.
That is a fascinating way to look at it. We are biased toward biology just because that is what we are used to. But biological brains are essentially just wet machines. Why should squishy tissue be any more capable of magic than highly complex silicon?
Exactly. Chalmers argues that we do not know of any principled fundamental differences between biological and non-biological systems that would definitively prove that only biology can produce consciousness. And in the absence of a principled difference, he believes the default rational attitude should be that both systems are theoretically capable of being conscious. And he does not just stop at intuition. He uses a very specific thought experiment to push this functionalist idea forward, centered around what he calls a functional isomorph.
A functional isomorph. That sounds like a very dense academic term. Let's unpack that. What exactly is a functional isomorph in the context of mind uploading?
Think of it as a perfect, high-fidelity digital duplicate. Imagine we build a perfect upload of a human brain inside a computer. For every single biological neuron in your original brain, we code a computational element that duplicates its input and output behavior flawlessly. If neuron A fires and causes neuron B to fire in the biological brain, then digital node A will fire and cause digital node B to fire in the computer. We also copy the non-neural components if they are relevant. Then, we connect this digital brain to inputs and outputs. Maybe we give it robotic eyes and a mechanical body, or maybe we drop it into a completely virtual reality environment.
So if this digital brain sees an apple, the virtual eyes activate, the digital optic nerve fires, the simulated visual cortex processes it, and the digital avatar reaches out to grab it, completely mirroring what my physical body would do.
Right? That complete point-for-point behavioral and structural mapping is what makes it a functional isomorph. It is isomorphic, meaning it has the exact same shape and function, just in a different medium. Now, Chalmers is careful to note that this assumes human cognition is actually computable. If the human brain relies on some kind of hyper-complex quantum physics that cannot be simulated algorithmically, then building a functional isomorph might be impossible. But assuming that brain functions can be computed, the big question remains. We have built this perfect digital mirror of your brain. Is it conscious?
And this is where the whole thing circles back to the methods of uploading we talked about at the very beginning. Because Chalmers suggests that the best way to figure out if this functional isomorph is actually conscious is to think about the gradual uploading process. The nanobots replacing the brain, one cell at a time. The text leaves us hanging right on that precipice, but you can see exactly where the logic is heading.
It is a brilliant logical trap. If you replace just one single neuron with a perfect digital replacement, do you lose your consciousness? No, of course not. What if you replace 2, 10, a million? At what specific point in that gradual replacement process would the lights suddenly turn off? The functionalist argument is that as long as the functional flow of information remains unbroken, the subjective experience, the consciousness, remains unbroken too.
It forces you to realize that the transition from meat to machine doesn't have to be a sudden death and recreation. It could be a continuous spectrum. And if consciousness can survive a gradual transition, then the entirely digital functional isomorph at the end of the process must be just as conscious as the biological brain at the beginning. It completely shatters the idea that our biological bodies are sacred or strictly necessary for our inner lives.
It really does. It challenges us to stop viewing ourselves as static physical objects and start viewing ourselves as dynamic patterns of information. If Chalmers is right, then the physical substrate, the meat of the brain, is just the current vehicle for that pattern. The future of the human mind might not be limited by biology at all.
That is both incredibly liberating and deeply unsettling. We have covered so much ground today, from destructive slicing and nanobot replacements to Mary's black and white room and the ultimate test of the functional isomorph. It makes you look in the mirror and wonder what exactly is looking back. Are you the cells, or are you the pattern running through them? If you had the choice today to replace one failing biological neuron with a perfect, indestructible digital one, would you do it? And if you did, would you ever be able to stop? Something to chew on until next time. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.